My grandmother came to live with us when I was 12. She wasn't ill, but at 89, my mother didn't want her living alone anymore. When my mom wasn't there, a caretaker would help during the day. On Saturday afternoons, while my mom did her shopping, I would watch my grandma. She was a kind and cheerful lady and would often tell me stories about her childhood. During this particular week, I had taken a book out of the library called Tales of Terror. That Saturday afternoon, we were in the living room, folding a basket of clean clothes, when I happened to ask her, "What's the scariest thing you can remember?" She paused, sitting back in her chair, and then slowly spoke. "When I was a girl, not much older than you, we lived in a small village. The only thing remarkable about it was the abbey. It was about 4 miles outside of the town up on a hill. No one knew exactly how old it was, but it looked like it had been there forever. An order of nuns had taken up residence there, and with the help of workmen from the village, they had begun a restoration of sorts. When I was 14, I was hired to work in the kitchens. The abbey was really the only source of employment for the village, and I was happy to have the work. My job was to clear the tables after meals, do the dishes, and sweep the floors. Most days, I would quickly finish the dishes and use my sweeping as a reason to explore. The massive stone entry opened up onto what was called the Great Hall, with several large rooms off to each side. This section was in fairly good condition and was used to greet important guests. The kitchens and sleeping quarters were on the right, and to the left was the chapel and a wide stone path that led to the oldest and most dilapidated section of the abbey. This was, of course, the part that I was most curious about. As the weeks passed, I took notice that every day at noon, a small plate of food was prepared and taken out of the kitchen and through the courtyard. It was then handed to the Mother Abbess. She, and only she, would carry the dish past the chapel and down the shaded path to the oldest part of the abbey. She would return in 20 minutes or so and then retire immediately to her room above the dining hall. The Mother Abbess was quite old and very strict. I tried my best to keep out of her way. I did my work and took pride in a job well done. Things went along this way until late September of my first year there. 2 of the nuns became ill, and then 2 became 4, and 4 became 6. It spread quickly, until the few that were left healthy spent their days taking care of the sick. I had been asked to do the dishes, then head home until further notice. They said I would be sent for when the sickness had passed. I finished my work and walked out into what I had never seen before, a completely empty courtyard. Looking down the old stone path, I thought, this may be my only chance. I took a quick glance around and then moved into the cool shadows of the walkway. I hurried up several steps and into the old wing of the abbey. Outside it was early afternoon, but in the dark stone hallway, it was twilight. Here, it was completely silent. I could hear my footsteps echo as I stepped slowly down the hall. The passage went on for a while, and it ended at the base of a narrow stairwell. Going up, I felt the curving stone walls with my hand, and at the top of the stairs, the hall branched out into 3 directions. I paused, considering retreating, starting to become worried that I would get lost. That was when I saw the footsteps, clearly marked in the thick dust of the floor. I followed them. They led down the hallway to the left and up a hallway so narrow that only one person could fit. At the top was a landing with 2 heavy oak doors on either side, directly opposite of each other. The doors each had a small barred window about 12 inches wide. Then I heard the whispering. It was a constant volley of words, spoken with urgency. I crept closer to the door to see if I could understand, but the words seemed to connect together, making some other language foreign to me. I don't know what possessed me, but I inched toward the bars. I had to see what was inside. Peeking through them, I saw only darkness. As my eyes adjusted, though, I started to make out a small figure. I could see a woman. It was difficult to see in the darkness, but she looked to be turned away from me. Her long hair was matted and unkempt, and she was whispering in a feverish pitch. It was then that something soft brushed against my ankle, and I fell back against the door with a scream. Something dark jumped away from me. Looking down, I was relieved to see that it was just the Abbey cat. He must have followed me from the kitchen, looking for something to eat. Standing back up, I brushed the dust from my clothes and then noticed the whispering had stopped. I turned around slowly and saw her face was just inches from mine. Her eyes were solid white, and I was so close that I could see tiny red veins running through them. She must have been blind, but it wasn't just her eyes. Before I fainted, I saw that she was grinning at me, and I heard her whisper 3 words. "You are mine." Those 3 words haunt my every waking moment. It would be fair to say that I thought of nothing else for weeks. Whenever I asked my grandmother what it meant, she would only shake her head and say, "I don't like to think about it." After a while, I noticed that she was becoming visibly upset, so I stopped asking. Eventually, I came to think of it as just a story she had heard, a story that had somehow grown into reality and mixed itself into her memories. Years went by and I went off to college. My grandmother, now in her mid-90s, was still able to get around, but had been diagnosed with dementia. There were good days and bad, but the days when her memory was vivid grew few and far between. My mom had retired, so she was able to be a full-time caregiver. Every once in a while, my grandma would wander away. My mother would find her 6 houses down, contentedly talking to a neighbor. I came home to help whenever I could. It was difficult, but things were manageable. That is until last week. It was a Monday morning, and it looked like it was going to be a beautiful summer day. My mom had settled my grandmother into the backyard glider and was in between doing the laundry and breakfast dishes. She had just come up from the basement. When glancing out the back window, she realized that my grandma was gone. Heading out the back door, my mom checked the yard, the path around the garage, and the driveway before heading to the sidewalk. Looking up and down the street, she saw nothing. Beginning to worry now, she enlisted a few neighbors to help with the search. They knocked on every door, checked every single backyard. It was over an hour later when they found her. She was 3 streets over in an old cemetery, but she wasn't looking at the graves. She was backed up against an old oak tree, staring terror-stricken at the cross over the entry of a church. My mother tried to calm her down, but my grandma didn't seem to hear or see anything else. She just kept staring at the church, holding the cross at her neck and chanting incomprehensible words over and over. My mother called an ambulance. Then she called me. It took me 3 hours to drive home, and I went straight to the hospital. I found my mom pacing back and forth at the window. She looked exhausted. She said that my grandma hadn't spoken or even opened her eyes since arriving at the hospital. I convinced my mom to go home and get some rest. Told her that I would stay here with grandma and promised to call if anything changed. Sometime after midnight, I must have closed my eyes for a moment, because the next thing I remember was someone quietly calling my name. Chris? Gram, are you alright? I'll get the doctor, I said. But as I moved to get up from my chair, she put her hand softly on my arm. No, she said quietly. I'm all right. Just give me a moment. I asked if she wanted some water. She nodded, so I poured her a glass from the bedside pitcher. Slowly sipping at the water, she glanced from me to the window and back. Chris, she said quietly, I need to tell you something about what happened at the Abbey. Grim, you should be resting, I said. There will be plenty of time for resting soon enough, she replied. I started to object, but she shook her head defiantly. Looking her straight in the eyes, I could see she was fully awake and aware, maybe for the first time in a long time. I nodded. She began right where she had left off, those many years ago. After I found the woman in the locked room, or the thing that had taken the form of a woman, I fainted. When I regained my senses, I was standing in a large chamber on the first floor of the Abbey. It was the room they'd used to care for the sick. Beds lined the walls. The nuns that had fallen ill were kept there. At first, I thought they were sleeping, and then I noticed their eyes, unblinking, staring out into nothingness. Bordering on hysteria now, I ran from bed to bed, but was only met with the same glassy stare. Raising my hand to stifle a scream, I saw that both of my hands were covered in blood. All I could do was stand frozen, looking down in shock. I felt something forceful clamp down on my shoulder, and it spun me around strongly. I found myself face to face with the Mother Abbess, her face twisted in grief and fury. I screamed, and with an iron grip, she half pulled, half dragged me down the hall to her quarters, locking the door behind us. She turned back to me, and I tried to speak, but no words would come. Her face softened as she spoke. It's all right, dear. It's all right. Now you must gather your wits, for we don't have much time. Walking me over to a wash basin, she told me to clean away the blood on my face and hands. Then she rummaged through a dresser and came back with a long white nightdress. She spoke softly, but with urgency. Put this on. You must leave here now and never return. Go home to your family and say nothing of this. Tell them only that I sent you home, that there was an illness in the Abbey, she said. Almost too afraid to ask, I stammered out. Did I? No. You are innocent in it. It has the ability to enter a body at will and use the human form like an empty husk. You are powerless to stop it. Do not blame yourself. If anything, the fault is mine. It has been in my charge for more than 50 years. I was careless. The Mother Abbess said, Is it still with me? I whispered. No, my dear. If that were the case, I would not still be among the living. Now, you must hurry, but before you go, you must promise me something. She gently removed a silver chain from around her neck, and I saw that it held a very old cross, along with a gold medallion of St. Benedict. Placing it around my neck, she looked at me with the utmost seriousness. You must promise never to take this off. It will keep you safe. It will keep her from finding you and your family, she said. Unlocking the door, she hurried me down the long hallway to the entrance of the Abbey. She stood at the opening and watched as I ran toward the village road until I was out of sight. The next morning I awoke to shouts and commotion. My mother told me there had been an accident and that the Abbey was on fire. More thoughts than you can imagine raced through my mind, and I ran outside to see smoke rising far off in the distance. It took a few days, but when the embers finally cooled, The villagers found that the oldest section of the abbey had burned and collapsed upon itself. They found some human remains in the ruins, even finding the bones of one body in the abbey chapel. The body was found charred but intact. I have no way of knowing, but I'm sure it was the Mother Abbess, released at last from her terrible charge, and I hope she is at peace. As my grandmother finished her story, she reached under the neck of her hospital gown and brought out an old silver chain. She motioned for me to come closer, and then she placed it around my neck. Here, my love, I won't need this anymore. Promise me that you will never take it off. I did what she asked. As I promised, I saw my grandmother suddenly relax, as if a weight had been lifted, or a promise kept. She closed her eyes to rest. She never opened them again. My grandmother passed away quietly, peacefully in her sleep the next day. My mom and I were by her side. I never told my mother the story. I've never told anyone until now. I always wear the silver chain. I never take it off. My grandmother kept her promise, and I will keep mine. And as always, boys and girls, thank you for watching. If you liked today's story, give it a thumbs up. To hear more stories like this one, hit the subscribe button, making sure you turn on that bell for notifications of when I publish new stories every Tuesday and Thursday. To support this channel, click the link for our Patreon in the description box below. Until next time, sweet dreams.